Educators, anti-racism is not your ally. At this point, you might be a little confused. If you haven't heard about anti-racism, if you aren't totally familiar with all its tenets, you might assume that anti-racism is something very basic and very familiar. Educators, by their very nature, are highly compassionate and caring. So the idea of anti-racism would seem to be a no-brainer. What educator wouldn't want to create an environment free of prejudice and hate? But the tenets of anti-racism have some specific content, and I want to talk about what that content is and some of the deeper implications that I think are actually problematic. Let's begin with what we want. So what does a teacher really want for their students? And I think universally, we all want certain things. We want all our students to be able to read well. We want our students to be able to write well, to understand math and science. We want them to know history. And ultimately, by the time they leave school, we want students to have control over their lives. But if you're like me and you've been through the system for enough years, you have concerns. So overall in the US, we see performance dropping. We definitely see Black and Hispanic students struggling at a higher rate, and we see what's called the achievement gap continue. Every year we get this data placed in front of us. We see the gaps between white and non-white students, and we always ask ourselves, how do we close this? And we never quite get a satisfactory answer. We all know that Black and Hispanic students especially, when they move into the adult world, will continue to face other kinds of gaps beyond this academic gap. They're going to experience gaps in wages, in employment numbers, in education level, and in housing, healthcare, and in well-being. So when we see those numbers and we see those realities, we have a lot of concerns. We want to help, but we're not sure how. So what are these achievement gaps? What do they mean? We know that poor performance does not equate poor intelligence. Students perform poorly academically, there is something missing, and it usually ends up being skills and knowledge. Some kind of skill has not been taught to them, some knowledge has not been adequately imparted to them, they haven't had the practice, they haven't had the training. And when they don't have that skills and knowledge, they can't perform well on the final tests, on the assessments that are used to measure their academic achievement. There are lots of reasons why this is. So just off the top of your head, you could probably think of a whole bunch of reasons why certain populations are struggling in this regard. We know that certain areas have a lack of resources. They might lack learning networks or role models. They might lack motivation. They might lack opportunities to practice their skills. They might not have the support. Some of them don't have quality teachers or curriculum. Some of them don't have opportunities or challenges. And others lack buy-in. Ultimately, what we see is squandered human potential. And of course, we know that many of these factors exist because of past and present injustice in our society. When we think, how do we solve this problem? The usual refrain we come up with off the top of our head is we just need to do more. So we need more resources, more networks, more support. And we want to focus all that support on those who need it the most, those who are disadvantaged. We'll think of things like better teaching and better instruction. Differentiate, reduce the impact of bias. We want to be more fair and be cognizant of ways that bias can impact outcomes. Because we think if we clear these unfair obstacles and unlock their potential, that they can compete on the same grounds. So with all these assumptions in mind, we might go to an anti-racist training and open up by saying, I want my students to succeed. And something that you should be ready to hear from an anti-racist trainer is the retort, no, you just want your students to be white. I want to talk about the AntiRacism brand for a minute to make you understand what they mean by this. The AntiRacism brand has a bunch of names and a bunch of related fields that are wrapped up inside it. You might hear critical studies, critical race theory, social justice theory, whiteness studies, critical discourse analysis. Sometimes it's called culturally responsive, and it has a whole bunch of other terms that are tied into the same school of thought. They're sort of under this big umbrella of different critical studies. Some of the core concepts, so things you will hear when you attend these kinds of trainings, are as follows. You'll hear about systems of supremacy or systems of power. You'll hear the words dismantling and deconstructing. You'll hear about other ways of knowing or other knowledges. A more technical term you might hear or you might not hear is viewpoint epistemology, but more commonly you'll hear about positionality or intersectionality. Anti-racist trainings have significant differences from traditional diversity trainings. One of the most famous proponents of critical race theory, anti-racist theory that's going around right now is, of course, Dr. Robin DiAngelo. So her seminars are highly popular. Her book, White Fragility, is extremely popular. But she and a couple others who are sort of big names in this field have really exploded in popularity within the last year. But we need to take a moment to really understand what's going on with this area of research of hers and similar people like her. When they talk about whiteness, what are they talking about? You might be under the impression that they're talking about white culture. And when you think of white culture, you generally are going to think about things that are sort of cultural artifacts, things that are subjective, things that are cultural norms that don't have any objective value necessarily. So for example, having a sort of European American style of clothing, speaking a certain dialect or a certain kind of English, reading books written by white people about white people, or watching film or television that feature white protagonists. So you think of all those things as elements of white culture. And if you think of it that way, you might come away thinking, yes, we should certainly open up to other kinds of cultural norms. We shouldn't discriminate people based on the way that they dress or the way that they speak. We should be open to reading books about other cultures, from other cultures. We should definitely be open to TV and movies that feature people other than white males. So these are all not controversial statements. I think most people would come away thinking that that is white culture and that's what they're talking about. But it actually isn't what they're talking about. They're not talking about subjective, aesthetic, cultural norms. They're actually talking about cultural values that they call whiteness. At an anti-racist training, you are eventually going to be presented with these terms listed as white supremacy culture. They use the term white supremacy culture synonymously with whiteness, and these particular words are listed as if they are culturally subjective values, with clear implication that not all cultures share them and that they are in themselves not inherently desirable. Implied, too, is the existence of non-white values, standing in opposition, which can replace these traits without any real loss. Whiteness, in their mind, holds these things, such as individualism, objectivity, worship of the written word, sense of urgency, fear of open conflict, and defensiveness. But these are not the only terms they feel apply to white culture. And then what you're going to find are documents like this one, which came from the Smithsonian, and this is adapted from the same resource, which outlines elements of white culture in the United States, also called, as we see at the top, white dominant culture or whiteness, refers to the ways white people and their traditions, attitudes, and ways of life have been normalized. So this is really what they're talking about. They're talking about ways of life and traditions, attitudes. So as you can see, there are a variety of traits that are listed as white culture. So some of the big ones, things like rugged individualism, the individual is the primary unit, self-reliance, independence, and autonomy, And then you have emphasis on the scientific method, which is objective, rational, linear thinking, cause and effect relationships, quantitative emphasis, Protestant work ethic, hard work is the key to success, work before play, future orientation, planning for the future, delayed gratification, progress is always best, tomorrow will be better, time, follow rigid time schedules, time is viewed as a commodity. And then a little further down, we have competition, which is being number one, winning at all costs, winners and losers, must always do something, decision making, majority rules. What you see here is that advantageous traits are lumped in with mere cultural preferences. The value of hard work is conflated with having 2.3 children. Planning for the future is as consequential as whether you choose to celebrate Christian holidays. Suffice to say, this is not rigorous sociological work. It doesn't seem that in creating this document or the documents associated with this panel, any kind of research was done. This is not a survey of white people in the United States. It's not a survey of European culture. It doesn't seem to be based on any kind of data. What it looks like has happened is that people with a certain perspective, people with a certain ideology, have sat down and written out things that they consider the cultural aspects of the United States. And because it's American, they have therefore prescribed it as white culture, when really more accurately, this is just generically American culture. What's even more confusing is even at the beginning here, it says that most people in America have been internalized with these elements of culture, including people of color. They're not elements that only white people have, and even they acknowledge this. It's instead just labeled white because it's the dominant set of values. So whiteness, white culture, white supremacy culture are all used synonymously. They're sort of traded in and out. And here we have some quotes from people like D'Angelo and her colleagues. And you can see reflections of this idea of whiteness and white culture in the things they say. So D'Angelo, for example, calls it the ideology of individualism, which insists that meritocracy is mostly real, that hard work and talent will be justly rewarded. So meritocracy, the idea of hard work and talent, the idea of individualism are all elements of white culture in her viewpoint. And this is continued by another professor who, at the bottom here, says that white culture values written over oral, values history over memory, rationalism over wisdom, and has validated and elevated positivistic white Eurocentric knowledge over non-white, indigenous, and non-European knowledges. Continued, it keeps saying the same thing, myth of meritocracy, valuing written communication over other forms. Another hallmark of white culture is scientific, linear thinking, cause and effect, white values of the King's English, objective, rational, linear thinking, quantitative emphasis, work before play, planning for the future, and adherence to rigid time schedules. And then we get to the end, in school and into the working world. This person lectures, tremendous harm is done by the pervasive rule that Black children and adults must bend to whiteness in substance, style, and format. You can see the underlying claim here is that whiteness, white culture, is imposing itself on especially Black people because Black people do not share these values. This is extended to all kinds of fields. So, for instance, they talk about math in some of these anti-racist trainings, that math is political, that math, which is supposedly objective, is not objective. It's actually a dangerous thing. They argue that math can be used to oppress and discriminate against people, so they want to spend time in the math classroom talking about this, to say that math is a dangerous element to white supremacy. You look at a website like Equitable Math, White supremacy culture shows up in math classrooms when the focus is on getting the right answer. Again, you see here, white supremacy culture, remember they say, is this whole idea of linear, logical thinking, objectivity, and then they elaborate below. The concept of mathematics being purely objective is unequivocally false, and teaching it is even much less so. Upholding the idea that there are always right and wrong answers perpetuate objectivity as well as fear of open conflict. And you'll remember both of those items are on that prior list. So you can kind of see how that original list of white supremacy culture traits sort of trickles down and affects all the other realms. So then we apply this logic to the question of the achievement gap. What does it mean to be anti-racist? So in their words, and these are Kendi's, Ibram X. Kendi's words, to be anti-racist is to view the inequities between all racialized ethnic groups as a problem of policy. A racist policy is any measure that produces or sustains racial inequity between racial groups. An anti-racist policy is any measure that produces or sustains racial equity between racial groups. So you see there's the opposite. One policy has inequity and one policy produces equity. One either allows racial inequities to persevere as a racist or confronts racial inequities as an anti-racist. In his argument and in other arguments, they look at those inequities, those academic inequities, and they say that is the evidence that racism has occurred. And in this article, they project a sequence of slides showing the persistence and degree of academic achievement gap between Black and white students throughout the country, and asked us at our racially mixed tables to discuss the reason behind these bar graphs. If you go on to read this article, you'll see that one of the persons at the table tries to talk out, maybe the inequities are due to this or this or this, and they start to list off possible reasons, but the instructor cuts them off and says, no, the cause of racial disparities is racism. If I show you data that's about race, we need to be talking about racism. Don't get caught up in detours. Inequities, such as in the academic achievement gap between races, in their mind, proves racism. The way to get rid of racism is to eliminate those inequities. If those gaps in their mind prove racism, how do they suggest we close those gaps? And this is where it gets a little trippy, because they don't propose to close the gaps. What they're doing here is a bait and switch. They're telling you that the racism is in the gaps because they're giving you those gaps as evidence that racism exists. But they don't actually think the racism is there. They don't think it's in the gap itself. They actually believe that the racism is in what's being measured. What outcome do they want? You might think they want the outcome of, say, reading levels to come out the same. But once you actually start to talk to them about what they desire, they don't particularly want that. First, we have closing the achievement or opportunity gap is a Western way of thinking about education. It's linear and views students as lacking something and needing to be turned into some ideal, which is defined by white supremacy. Right in that quote, you can see echoes of what we talked about earlier. White supremacy is this emphasis on linear, logical, rational thinking. And so the idea of closing the gaps is just one of those ways of thinking. For these reasons, ontological distance should always exist. We should never close that gap because it provides space for reflection and growth. Do they want to close the gap? No, they actually don't. They don't think that's important. Further, equity efforts should never be about fixing anything about students. Effective equity efforts focus not on fixing students of color, but on eliminating racist conditions. They don't think there's actually anything wrong. There's no missing skills. There's no missing knowledge. It's just that what's being measured is incorrect. And again, to the right, rather than merely closing a gap, ethnic studies intentionally works toward helping pay this education debt. Students are asked to achieve academic success in a humanizing and critically conscious way, while demanding the education system reconsider what constitutes the parameters of academic success. So what is success? Well, it's certainly not reading levels, it's not writing skills, it's not knowledge of history or science or math, it's something else. Kendi reflects this in his own words in his own book. For instance, when he talks about the academic achievement gap, he dismisses it and says we shouldn't worry about that. Instead, he asks, what if the intellect of a low-testing black child in a poor black school is different from, and not inferior to, the intellect of a high-testing white child in a rich white school? What if he measured intelligence by how knowledgeable individuals are about their own environments? So I want you to catch, again, earlier, Kendi was saying those achievement gaps are evidence of racism. And by having a policy that produces no inequities, we would eliminate racism. And yet he does not want to close these gaps. Instead, he says, why are we even measuring those gaps? We should be not measuring those things. We should be measuring other things. And as final proof here, we have a lack of a finish line. Through the critical whiteness lens, the racial justice conversation includes the everlasting fight to eradicate racism. The act of working to be anti-racist is a lifelong commitment, meaning there is not a finish line. Here, there is a belief that racism can be fixed by raising everybody up to white standards. First, they say there is no resolution to the racism problem. Kendi is at best being very disingenuous when he tells us that having a anti-racist policy would produce no inequities, because they don't really believe that's possible. Secondly, they say closing the achievement gap does not reduce or eliminate racism. In fact, the attempt of closing the gap is portrayed as the belief that you're trying to fix students to white standards. You're trying to make students act white. You're trying to make them behave in the standard of white behavior. Their solution is a whole bunch of words that are very loaded and probably unfamiliar to you, but it involves deprogramming, deconstructing dominant narratives, engaging in a lifelong commitment, an everlasting fight to eradicate racism, which by its own definition will never happen. It is to say this: it is unfair to measure Black children's literacy, scientific understanding, work ethic, and or numeracy skills because they are inherently less acculturated to or possibly less capable of acquiring those traits. This is really what they believe. They believe that there is something inherent about, in particular, Black children that prevents them from acquiring the traits of white culture. And they say that literacy and science and work ethic and numeracy skills are all white traits. This is most easily understood, and this is a common image that you'll see in teacher trainings. I have certainly encountered this image many times in my career. And of course, allegories always fail at some point. You could sit and you could pick apart this allegory here and show all the kinds of problems that there are with these images. But there is something really important to see here. So we have equality on the left, where everyone's given the equal amount of resources, and of course what results is an inequitable outcome. Different students succeed at different rates. In the middle is often what is portrayed as equity. This is what's often presented to teachers as the best outcome, which is that some students get lots of support, and some students get a little bit of support, and some students need basically no support, and they can all succeed in the end. And that's sort of the dream of the equitable classroom. But I think that anti-racists actually want to go a step further, and the furthest right image is what is called liberation. And I want us to take a moment to consider, why is this liberation? See that the fence is gone. See that there's no more barrier to seeing the baseball game. There's no more barrier between the students and just full access to the world. And I think what they really believe this to mean is that the whole barrier system, the whole sense of that they have to overcome anything, that they have to learn anything, that they need any of those skills, that they need any knowledge, they are throwing that out the window. They don't think those things are necessary. They really just want students to be liberated from any of these traits. Now, in part, I know this because some of the foundations of critical race theory are quite explicit about what they want. So, for example, here, unlike traditional civil rights discourse, which embraces incrementalism and step-by-step progress, critical race theory questions the very foundations of the liberal order, including equality theory, legal reasoning, Enlightenment rationalism, and neutral principles of constitutional law. For this reason, we can understand that critical race theorists aren't interested in closing the achievement gap. They aren't interested in improving skills or knowledge among students of different groupings. Instead, they are interested in eliminating the very foundation, the very definitions of what we consider to be skills, of what we consider to be knowledge. The language of dismantling rules this ideology. The tricky part about dismantling is once you start to dismantle, once you start to question the purpose and meaning of certain elements, it's very hard to stop. And we see this time and time again in districts where this process begins. You might begin by saying, why do we have standardized tests? That's a legitimate question. But soon after we ask that, then we ask, why do we have testing at all? Why do we have standards? Why do we need homework? In fact, why do we need classwork or schedules or tardies? Why do we have letter grades? Why do we have grades at all? Why do we have SPED or honors or AP or gifted and talented? Why do we teach Shakespeare? In fact, why teach Western authors at all? Why teach books? Why have security officers? Why have suspensions or discipline or codes of conduct? Why should we teach standard English? Why should we teach grammar? Why should we teach essay writing? Why should we teach writing? Why do we have curriculum? Why do we have administrators? Why do we even have teachers? Why have school? I realize this kind of argument sounds like a slippery slope, but these slopes have already started to slip. And as you can imagine, as blocks are taken out of this Jenga tower, things are starting to teeter. We see that certain institutions are starting to collapse, and this is all part of the plan. They actually intend to dismantle and to deconstruct until the institution is completely gone and replaced with something else. We can see this kind of language in the wild. We know this is something that some critical race theorists and some radical reconstructionists teach and say. They'll say things like, we should stop grading. We should stop assigning homework. We should stop testing. We should stop worrying about learning. In some districts, they've already tried to abolish the grading system. They've abolished letter grades. They don't have papers. They don't have quizzes or tests. In fact, they don't really have tardy systems. They don't have attendance processes. Under the new system, pupils will not be penalized for failing to complete assignments or even show up for class, and teachers will give them extra opportunities to demonstrate their mastery of subjects. What constitutes mastery is not quite clear, but grades shall not be influenced by behavior or factors that directly measure students' knowledge and skills in the content area. When Robin DiAngelo and her colleagues are asked what they envision as the future, what institution is going to replace this completely dismantled school system, here is the language and the wording they give. He invoked instead a journey towards a new world, a world first and foremost where we have elevated the consciousness, where we pay attention to the human being. The new world, he continued, would be a place where we aren't armed to distrust, to be isolated to hate, a place where we actually love. And Mandy Jackson, too, sounded all but utopian as she envisioned a movement away from capitalist Western ideals and described a future education system that would be transformed, built around students telling their stories and listening to the stories of others, and creating in us the feeling that we belong to each other as people. What I want to highlight here is what is missing from their description of this new system, of this new world that they envision. I don't see any mention of learning. I don't see any mention of skills or development or growth. There's certainly no challenge in this kind of system, and there's definitely no measurement. Once critical race theorists have control of a school, what would it look like? And I think the best way to describe a critical race theory school is a church. Each subject is not going to be allowed to stay neutral. Each subject will be injected with racial questions, questions about racism and prejudice, questions about systems of oppression, questions about intersectionality. Every subject is going to be looked at through this kind of lens. Ultimately, this is going to transform public education institutions into places of orthodoxy. In summary, anti-racist trainings posit that hard work, linear thinking, individualism, planning for the future, math, science, and literacy are all white traits. They also posit that non-white students should not be expected to excel in these areas. To either insist or encourage these traits is a form of white supremacy. Closing the academic achievement gap is impossible and in reality shouldn't be attempted. Education institutions should be dismantled, stripped of any white academic content, and be replaced with political activism, intuitive knowledge, and personal storytelling. In conclusion, I have a series of objections to this kind of anti-racist ideology. As teachers, we can't and shouldn't believe only white students can attain academic success. Math, science, literacy, and liberal education are universally valuable and should be for the benefit of everyone. Focusing schools away from academic skills will benefit the affluent, not the poor or marginalized. This ideology gives dysfunctional school systems an excuse for corruption, underperformance, and inefficacy. Without measurement, we won't know what students need. And finally, if we were to change our goals to these other skills, how will our students compete in a globalized market? Thank you for watching, and I hope you learned something. Please feel free to share or comment on this video. Let me know what you think.